Hello, everyone, and welcome back to Catholic Family News. This is Murray Rundus, the production manager and managing editor here at Catholic Family News, and I'm very happy to be joined once again by Serre Verweij. Now, we had a big show a few weeks ago now, I think it was, analyzing the upcoming conclave it was at the time, but of course, since then, a lot of things have changed. Of course, the most obvious is that Pope Francis passed away, and then we've had all of these conclave dealings since then. And so there's a lot to talk about. There's a lot to cover as we're in this final weekend leading up to the conclave. And so really just to begin, Serre, I'm hoping you can sort of lay the groundwork out for us, because the first thing I want to establish is something you and I talked about on that last show was about these two opposing, or really you can even think of it as three factions, the liberal progressives, the conservatives, and the moderates, and we use those terms relative to the conclave. Have we seen that happen? Are there factions in the conclave working, politicking? Is that something we've seen? And in addition, who do you think is winning at that game as it currently stands?
We're definitely seeing those camps, but we're indeed mainly seeing two opposing camps, the conservatives and the liberals, where the moderates aren't really a camp as much as just what's in between these two camps. And so the moderates are the ones both camps are going to want to win over. It does seem as though the conservatives are indeed surprisingly strong. I mean, surprisingly for most commentators. I've even heard that Austin Verweij, who obviously gets his information from more progressive sources, and they might be engaging in some wishful thinking, but they can't even discount the possibility that Cardinal Erdo's conservative bloc at least has a veto minority, which to some commentators would already be worrisome. I've not really seen an indication that liberals have a clear veto bloc as such. More progressive outlets are pushing the idea that liberals have more appeal or would have more support from the moderates, but that's not even really stated very explicitly. It's just more implied by their grandstanding. But yes, we're seeing conservatives and liberals fight and trying to win over the moderates. And in my opinion, at least until yesterday or last Friday, the conservatives were winning. And during the last general congregation, it seems as though liberals finally were having quite a few interventions, and they were putting forward their view and defending Francis's pontificate. And Lana Sean even described one progressive intervention as a bombshell, but that basically is progressives commenting on themselves. And so the question is how much appeal that had. It should be noted that this general congregation was attended by less cardinals than the few before that, and that was in fact noted. So the day the liberals had their say was the day that less cardinals were present and listening. So make of that what you will. So maybe they've actually been able to turn things around, but I've not really seen a lot of confirmation of that. They were speaking of cardinals from different continents defending Francis's vision, but the real names that I saw named at Lanchon and then also with National Catholic Reporter, they were talking about the usual suspects. Rabat from Morocco is obviously not an African cardinal, but he's a European liberal who's a missionary leader there. And we always knew that those were liberal. He and Vesco from Algiers both are like that. They've both descended from Fiducia Supplicants. Chow from Hong Kong, the left-wing Jesuit and probably the most left-wing cardinal from all of Asia. I think even more left-wing than Tagle. Yeah, he said similar things. So the usual suspects had their day. The question is, have they been able to win over any moderates, or have there been any seeming moderates who were crypto radicals? And so far, I've seen that extremely little. I mean, maybe Sacco from the Chaldean Catholic Church was signaling that he'd vote for someone like Parolin or Tagle, but even that's debatable. I've not seen a lot of moderates supporting the progressive agenda. I've not seen progressives bragging about specific things. We have had stories about that there will be 40 to 50 cardinals ready to support Parolin, but we had the exact same stories about Scola in 2013. Italian sources always give inflated numbers to the Italian candidates. And one story where like Suppi would have about 40 votes and Parolin would have about 40 votes seems to imply that about 2/3 of the electors are prepared to vote for two Italians, which definitely seems laughable. But then again, I recently saw an article that was suggesting that due to the financial report showing financial troubles in the Vatican, Reinhard Marx would be on his way to become the next pope now.
Yeah, we've seen some wild speculation. I think, there's there's some people who will say it's likely to be, because we have this conservative and liberal faction, it's likely to be a surprise. But, it's sort of backing up a little bit, because I want to get to those general congregations, because I think those are actually really important to read correctly. I've seen some people panic and not understand what's going on there. But before we get into that, I want to talk about how the conservatives came in with a strategy, because that's something that I think was interesting for me to see, and I want to see if you share my perspective. I saw them as coming in being very organized, very clear messaging, and they really surrounded that concept of unity as Cardinal. And I really saw it's Cardinal Mueller is the one who kicked a lot of this off, talking about that perspective of unity, finding unity in doctrinal clarity. And I mean, we even saw some of the episcopate, people like Bishop Robert Barron, who I would put in that more conservative camp, especially just how recent events have gone. He's even come out critiquing Pope Francis, and many of these bishops and cardinals came out critiquing Pope Francis. So do you think that strategy of doctrinal unity is what's made them be successful, or at least have the appearance of success as it currently is? Or do you think it was something else? Do you think something else appeals to, has helped them give them this advantage as it currently stands?
I definitely think what you're saying here is correct. I believe there is somewhat more to it, but I would say it's the primary issue. And the unity message has been visibly successful because Nichols from the UK, whom I had categorized as a moderate liberal, he came out in support of it. Ribat from Papua New Guinea, obscure third world cardinal, I had him as a moderate, where it was like, maybe he's left-leaning, maybe he's right-leaning, maybe he's so perfectly in the middle that he's neither. It's like toast. You can put whatever you want on it. He came out in support of the unity message. And Jose Cobocano from Madrid, he recently had some progressives posting that he would have said that you couldn't reverse things from Pope Francis. He had said it in some Spanish interview. And then conservatives ran with that. They just posted the excerpts from that were posted. And then if you managed to bypass the paywall by using Google Translate, I would advise that to people, by the way, and you read the whole thing, he is basically saying that every pope builds on the things from previous popes and integrates them, and so that would have to happen with Francis too. But he also said that the next pope, that every pope provides the unity of St. Peter and all that. He was also referencing the unity message. And if you read the whole thing, he even suggested that Pope Francis couldn't silence critics like Cardinal Mueller and had to take things they said into account, and that he would have worked that into his pontificate. And I find that last part to be very dubious, but that is nevertheless how Cobocano portrayed it. So I've seen only really the radical liberals attack the unity message. Serre, that Jesuit, Czechian Canadian cardinal, he attacked the unity message. And if you ask me, in a way that is only likely to help the conservatives. Scott Smith commented on that, how bad their strategy was. And I think the best angle for liberals was probably to frame it as indeed an attack on Pope Francis, and as throwing out the baby with the bathwater, that if you follow this route, if you're afraid of this unity, that you become too reactionary, and then you'll, I'm not saying that that's bad, but they would frame it that way towards moderates, then you'll throw away the good stuff of Pope Francis. I think they wanted to go with that angle, and I think that ironically became very problematic for two reasons. One, the conservatives were smart. They had a positive message. They mainly focus on unity in a positive sense, and they focus on defending that. And in doing so, they can indirectly attack cardinals like Greg, Hollerich, and Reinhard Marx, cardinals who were more radical than Pope Francis, I should say. They can basically attack the more radical cardinals who were, in a way, piggybacking Pope Francis's pontificate without directly attacking any person, while focusing on positive themes. And the real kicker is that it was Parolin's faction. It was the moderates whom might have been acceptable to third world moderates, because Parolin, he's obviously not a real moderate, but he's a moderate liberal, and he could have tried to appeal to third world moderates by, on the one hand, defending unity against radical Germans, but on the other hand, seeming like less of a break with Pope Francis. But he and the cardinals who supported him decided to directly and openly attack Pope Francis by name. So now it are the moderate libs, or the moderates, if you will, who started attacking Pope Francis. While the conservatives, they didn't say a mean thing about him. They were implicitly attacking the Germans while focusing on positive themes. So I think that it must have really helped the conservatives. The Parolin basically took the heat for attacking Pope Francis. And there does seem to be a general dislike for significant aspects of Pope Francis's pontificate. I would say amongst the third world his focus on dialogue, whether it's real or not, his many travels, his whole style was popular, but his way of unilaterally doing things, holding a synod and then releasing fiducia supplicans, his dealings with China without really involving Asian bishops, all that sort of stuff, I don't think was very popular. So.
Yeah, and I want to get back to Parolin too in a minute, because I think that's a very interesting story. In many ways, that's been one of the most interesting things to see at this conclave. But finishing on the conservatives, I think you mentioned at the beginning how it's Cardinal Erdo's block, and I've noticed people on the ground here in Rome, they definitely think that. At his titular church, his mass, the media surrounded it and I just talking to Vatican journalists, many of them consider him now, if not the front running candidate, one of them. And I wanted to get your perspective. Do you think, just seeing what these cardinals have said, do you think that's something in reality? Do you think he has the backing? Do you think that's where the conservatives are really rallying around, trying to get him in as Pope? Is he the conservative favorite? And secondly, connected with this, at the beginning of this conclave, Cardinal Mueller was said to be electable. He was put in the papabile status with many different journalistic websites. But at this point, I'm wondering if that bold opening statement he made sort of just disqualifies him almost. If he's sort of full of radiation, people wouldn't vote for him because of how bold that statement was. What do you think? Do you see that the unity message is around Erdo? Erdo is the guy for the conservatives to go to. And do you think Mueller just simply has no chance anymore? We should take him off that list.
I will address it of Mueller first. It's interesting. I took him off my list of papabile years ago, actually, because I don't think Mueller had that ambition. And as such, he didn't act accordingly. That's one. And two, his chances were always somewhat smaller because of his very direct role in the controversies of Pope Francis's pontificate, but also because, I will be frank, he's German, and we had an Argentinian between him and Benedict XVI. But I do believe it's kind of like how we won't get another Jesuit Pope and likely not a Latin American and things like that. So yeah, I think you can take Mueller off that list. I did so long ago, and I think Mueller's actions show he didn't consider himself to be on it in the first place. I think he doesn't mind being a more outspoken candidate and helping the conservative candidate. As for the issue of Erdo, I do think he currently seems to be the front runner for the conservative bloc. But what I really think is that the conservative bloc, above all, has rallied behind a message. And I think that's smart. They have a very clear message, like we described the unity message, but it's also more developed. And I was hoping to get into that. But they have a more clearly defined message as opposed to the liberals. And when it comes to the different possible conservative candidates, in a weird way, they're more interchangeable in a good way. They basically have a clearly defined and likable message. And whichever conservative cardinal they end up nominating, perhaps even by surprise, perfectly or almost perfectly stands for that message. And so now it's just a question of seeing which of those candidates is the most likely to get the 2/3 majority. Where with the liberals, Parolin is a radically different person from Tagle, and Tagle from Zuppi. And you had that Tolentino Concha from Portugal mentioned. All of these promise a very different pontificate, but whether it's then actually Erdo or Eijk or surprisingly Serre, they would basically stand for the same program. It would just be a question of seeing who can win over the 2/3. And so I can't entirely discount the possibility that they would use Erdo as a smokescreen and surprise liberals by having nominated Eijk, or even Serre using his incredible old age to push him as a transitional pope. So I think they at least wanted to look like Erdo as the candidate, but whether he really is, I'm not entirely certain. And if he is, but he doesn't seem to do so well during the first ballot that he could eventually win, then I can see them easily replacing him with Eijk, because it's not about the person, it's not about a personality cult, it's about a message. And finally, I will say, I do think it's possible that certain conservatives are slightly skeptical of Erdo because, well, in a way, they are sticklers in a good way. So I don't think they easily idolize a candidate. And I suspect possibly Burke and Mueller specifically might not be 100% fans of him, but I think they find him good enough. And if he seems to be the one to win for the sake of orthodoxy, I think they will stand behind him. But I weirdly enough have had the impression that Mueller was skeptical about Erdo just a little bit, as not the ideal candidate. It's good enough, but not ideal, since 2022. I've actually had an impression because weirdly enough, I think Mueller hinted at something like that in an interview. It was back when I was in Jerusalem, and it's an obscure interview now. I hope to still be able to find it. But yes, for now it does seem as though they are willing to support Erdo. They think he's good enough to defend orthodoxy, and they're treating him as their candidate. And so I do think there's a strong conservative bloc surrounding him, and he currently has significant chance. And I would say he's either in the top 3 or the top 2 candidates who can currently win. That's what I will say about that.
No, that's very interesting, and I'll say too, Erdo is not my favorite of the bunch. Even seeing his mass today, it wasn't the kind of like liturgical return to tradition that you see with some of these other more even mainstream candidates like Cardinal Serre or again, Cardinal Mueller is not really in the picture anymore, but I think these candidates are going to be, and these cardinals are going to be those sticklers that you mentioned. But if what you're saying is true, I think it's very significant, because if the message is this strong coming into the conclave, then as you mentioned, it's just about picking the right guy who has the optics, gives off the impression to actually just win over those moderates. So let's jump into that message, because that message is extremely important. We talked about the unity and how that's really at the forefront. What else do you see being that conservative message? What is making that have some steam going into this conclave?
If you check the updates of Vatican News on what was said during the general congregations, what showed up multiple times was once they finally started discussing synodality. And I should note, by the way, that synodality wasn't really mentioned for quite a few days after Francis's death. It wasn't really considered too important. But once it started to be brought up again, the constant focus was on how synodality and episcopal collegiality could be combined. And if you can read between the lines, it basically means we don't want to happen what seems to be happening, or where we seem to be headed under Francis, and what Greg and the Germans push, which is that basically we get a combination of kind of a Protestantization where the laity takes over the local churches and controls the bishops, mixed with that a centralizing despotic pope in Rome can use handpicked laity to justify what he does. So it's basically you have the laity and you have the pope, and the pope can just now bypass bishops, bypass tradition, bypass canon law by invoking whatever he calls the sensus fidelium. And I think it's very clear that they now desired episcopal collegiality, and that's an irony, because for the longest time, episcopal collegiality was a progressive theme. It was during Vatican II, and it was used against John Paul II and Benedict XVI. Oh no, they're too centralistic, and their curie, that's too centralistic and too mean. Episcopal collegiality was pushed as this thing where local bishop conferences needed to get more doctrinal authority, and Rome needed to lord less over cardinals. And then Francis came in, and at first he seemed to sympathize with that, and he let the Germans do more what they wanted. But then he started to bypass the curie, and finally he and the curie started to bypass the national bishops. They did it with Traditionis Custodes, with fiducious supplicants. They basically told you, oh, you suddenly have to ban very popular Tridentine masses. And many bishops who weren't necessarily traditionalists were like, I don't want to ban a mass that's very popular. I don't want to drive down support and donations in this church. And they were told out of the blue they had to do that. They were told out of the blue they had to allow priests to bless gay couples, and that sort of stuff has really created the backlash against this. Bishops want to still be recognized as successors to the apostles with legitimate doctrinal and governmental authority. And so I think that has been a very important part of this message, that the irony is that now conservatives are the ones pushing the theme of episcopal collegiality. It's how we went from, in 2004, Republicans stand for war and Democrats stand for let's end war, to eventually Trump being the one who's like, no war in the Middle East. And it's the Democrats who want war in the Middle East. And now it's suddenly the progressives who stand for a weird mixture of papal centralism and populism. And the conservatives are like, we need a harmony between Rome and the bishops of the world. And I think that message is obviously very popular, mainly because many of the cardinals from the peripheries named by Francis don't want to suddenly be told, oh, hey, you have to do this thing in Thailand now, because we held a meeting with 500 laity, a big part of whom are from the United States and Germany and Belgium, and they said, oh, you have to allow transgender priests now. I think that's a big part of the popularity of the unity message too, the harmony of the worldwide church.
Yeah, and that change is a very good insight, and that's something most people are not getting. And that subtle switch, because as you mentioned, this is really more about it's about solidarity for these bishops. And again, one might have problems with collegiality and the nitty gritty workings with it. Of course, that's one of the big debates with the Second Vatican Council. But the main point is that this is not it's not being expressed in the same way as like a progressive would have expressed collegiality back 25 years ago. And the reason why this is getting misunderstood, I think, is because when we're talking about these general congregations, which are these meetings of the cardinals where they talk about the issues facing the church, we don't get the full transcripts of that. We simply get what the Vatican press gives us, and which is a very short excerpts of everything and a recap. And oftentimes, I mean, I've noticed this myself when I get the original that they send us. It's obviously biased in a way, trying to make it seem like it's just the Pope Francis message. So you do have to do some reading between the lines in what you're doing there. And it's I think it's obvious once you start going into this, realizing that you have to read it in between the lines, that there was some real movement on the conservative side going into it. But maybe going more towards the liberals, and I want to look at their options at this point.
Definitely.
But maybe to start out with their most popular, which is Cardinal Parolin. He's been really the highlight of this conclave, I've noticed. So many people are talking about Parolin. Here in Rome, everybody's just Parolin, Parolin, Parolin everywhere. Now, the way I perceive it is that he had a ton of momentum coming into it, which is rather surprising. We had those articles talking about 40 or 50 candidates are behind him. But then we had a number of things happen. We had the health scare, which is debated by the Vatican, but other media corroborates it. That was one thing that happened. I think we just saw some skepticism because of the Chinese bishops the Chinese Patriotic Association consecrating bishops without papal approval. That was sort of blamed on Parolin. And we've seen just a sort of negative reaction towards the cardinal just as the days go on. Am I right in thinking he's no longer the front runner, or do you think he's still in that position?
I think you're right that he's no longer the front runner. I would say he's currently even the number 3 candidate. But currently those rumors are being denied, and I believe the denials that conservatives would have made a deal with Parolin. And I believe some have said the Parolin's team would have pushed these themselves, but I think it's possible liberals who are anti-Parolin and anti-conservative can have pushed this too. It's hard to tell, but I can't entirely discount the possibility that somehow conservatives, weirdly enough, would help Parolin towards a supermajority if some kind of weird scheme thing is pulled. But if we're talking about the current situation, so the momentum heading into the conclave and not later backroom deals, I would say he's indeed likely number 3. And I think one thing that harmed him is that clearly the liberals have become so unconfident in many of their picks that they settled with him as the best option they had for the liberal candidate. And as a result, you had no strong liberal candidate going into the conclave against the conservatives, where he could frame himself as the compromise candidate. So he came into it as defining basically the liberal bloc. So the liberals, in a way, started off with low expectations. You can even see that with Reinhard Marx having said, like, well, the new pope shouldn't be either a conservative or a progressive. And Omella, that progressive ally of Francis from Barcelona, he said similar things. And I was like, well, if the progressives start by saying, well, let's compromise, they seem to start from a position of weakness. And so then they choose Parolin. He defines the left bloc against the conservatives. And so then he starts to falter. And so it seems as though progressives started to splinter, to scramble, and to look for alternative candidates. And at the same time, it seems as though they kind of wanted to push a moderate who would be in between Parolin or Erdo, or at least would be perceived as such. And so, yeah, I think Parolin is a sinking ship. And I currently think his chances are small. But it's connected to the issue of who the progressives are now pushing as the progressive and who's being pushed as the moderate. And so there were rumors that they'd passed over Zuppi and that they'd gone for Tolentino Majonka, that Portuguese prefect of the dicastery for education and culture. And when I read it, I was like, well, that's wonderful. Some people were worried, like, he will be a terrible pope. And I was like, oh, yeah, definitely. But that's so self-evident. It's when the Democrats chose Kamala Harris to go up against Trump. I'm like, that's I mean, he was never a diocesan bishop. He has, from what I know, very little to no knowledge about canon law. He had no real prior curial experience till Francis picked him up from obscurity. He isn't very charismatic, doesn't have real big worldwide connections. He has no experience as a nuncio, so he only has the curie experience of the last few years under Francis. And during that, the main thing he did was basically help to rubber stamp giving official recognition to a radical German theologian to teach at some university. And beyond that, he has been rumored to be a homosexual, and the rumors with him seem stronger than with almost any other cardinal. So honestly, I was like, yeah, he'll instantly get the vote of 30 liberals if they unite behind him, and then of pretty much no one else. So, but the fact that they passed over Zuppi to get to him is interesting, and Zuppi went home for a day, and some perceived it as dropping out. But even if it was a pretend dropping out, I don't think that really looks good to most cardinals, that you kind of go home for a day during the preparations to choose the next pope. I don't think that looks good. And so far, I don't see Zuppi having great momentum. So suddenly they started to talk about Tagle again. And the liberal media, betting markets had him as the top candidate. And that was hilarious. I was like, well, you people, you live in the past. You seem to think it's 4 years ago. Haven't you kept up with the fact that Pope Francis fired him as head of Caritas International because he'd be that incompetent, that it wasn't even an ideological purge? Tagle's star was viewed as waning according to left-wing Catholic publications. So it was only really secular news that was living as if it was 4 years ago, when he was the Asian Francis, when he was in his prime. They were the ones who were thinking Tagle was a viable candidate. And now I was like, I'm not hearing anything from him. I didn't hear anything about him till Parolin started to falter, till it became pretty clear that Tolentino wouldn't really be that great. Zuppi was kind of passed over. And then slowly I was hearing about Tagle, but I really don't think Tagle will beat. I really don't see it with Tolentino, and I only see it with Zuppi through a very clever conspiracy. I just can't entirely count it out with Parolin. I also have to quickly mention they seem to want to push Avelin from Messiah as the moderate left candidate, but that barely came off for two reasons. One, he can't speak Italian, and that's a big handicap. Kikuchi from Tokyo apparently has the same problem. So those are two alleged center leftists from the peripheries who can't speak Italian and have no experience in Rome. And in the case of Avelin, a centrist French cardinal, not even one of the right-wing French cardinals, but the centrist Cardinal Barberin, came out directly attacking him while also attacking Parolin for good measure, and Parolin being publicly attacked. Well, publicly attacking other cardinals is rare during any conclave, and now it's being done by a centrist. So that kind of helped Parolin. But so, yeah, after everything that has happened, I think chances have decreased for Tagle, Zuppi, Tolentino, Avelin, and Parolin. And so I think Parolin is kind of the third chance person, or maybe Zuppi or Tagle, whomever the left settles on. But Tolentino would never work. So I currently think it mainly has become a contest between the centrist compromise candidate and a conservative one. And the conservative one is presumed to be Erdo. But so, yeah, I think it's mainly the conservative, probably Erdo, versus the centrist one, not Parolin.
Yeah, I mean, that's really the amazing thing, I think, out of this, that and again, we could be completely wrong. Something could change Monday, Tuesday, and then in the conclave, big moves can happen, of course, during the conclave itself. But just as it currently stands, it seems like the mainline progressive candidates just killed their chances. I mean, I hear no mention of Zuppi here anymore since he went back home, because it was seen, it was perceived, at least by parts of the Italian media, and I cannot imagine being a cardinal and seeing that news and saying, let's give this man the papal tiara, or not the papal tiara, the papal mitre, I guess it is now. I can't imagine doing that. And as you mentioned with Cardinal Parolin, that's another thing, getting attacked by other cardinals. I don't see him becoming elected anymore. One more that I want to give you, though, I want to see your perspective, is, and I want to see if you think I'm reading too much into this, but Cardinal Fernandez, who I think on paper should be a candidate that should be looked at as being, well, he had a major role in the Francis pontificate. The thing I noticed was at these Novem Dialis homilies, these funeral homilies, they switched out Kevin Farrell for Cardinal Fernandez. Fernandez comes in, he delivers this hard, very long and in some parts eloquent speech on the sort of being a worker priest and having Francis go in there, and how Francis was a sort of workaholic. And I see that, and I see some other statements of Cardinal Fernandez, and I see just the role that Cardinal Fernandez has played. Do you see him as being somebody the progressives could rally around?
No,
because at this point, I don't see anybody else.
No, I can clearly say that not Fernandez. So if they're rallying behind anyone else, they will probably just go for broke and try one of the damaged ones anyways. Either Tagle, but that won't work. Soupy, which, well, maybe there's a 5 to 10% chance that would work, and that frightens me, but not a big chance. They might try to do a weird troll logic thing with Tolentino Bedonka, and they might still try it with Parolin anyways and just settle on him, because Parolin, even now, would be better than Fernandez. When it comes to switching things out, I think it's possible Verweij was just busy with all of the general congregation stuff. He was busy politicking, or maybe, just maybe, in spite of being a moderate progressive, he didn't have enough nice things to say about Francis. I mean, he conducted his funeral while wearing a liturgical vestment Francis likely would not have approved of him wearing. Maybe Fernandez begged for it as his last moment of fame, and they were like, sure, why not? But Fernandez as the candidate, I mean, he'd be another Argentinian, and it's never going. I mean, maybe if the progressives are crazy, or if they're doing him as a distraction. I can't entirely discount that, but that basically would mean they're not planning for the progressive to win. So they might use him as a manipulation candidate. But if Fernandez gets like 20 or so votes in the first ballot, if he's really kind of pushed as a probability, that's a trick. I feel pretty confident saying that. There's more than a 90% chance that that's a trick. Watch out for that. You're being played. Whoever is then slightly to the left of Fernandez, watch out for whoever that is. But don't think Fernandez is going to win. Don't waste time trying to stop Fernandez. It would have been as if conservative cardinals in 2013 had spent time trying to stop Godfried de Nils from Belgium or Mara Diaga from Honduras. You're being distracted, and you shouldn't focus on that. The focus should be on if someone like Tagle or Zupi does come off the ground, just killing that and its cradle, that would have to be the focus, or Parolin if that comes off the ground. And beyond that, keeping your eyes on whichever centrist is being pushed. I think that's really the relevant thing. But so, yeah, I think we've discussed the liberal candidates there. I think in a lot of ways, the possible compromise candidates become way more relevant. I think that's what to watch out for. I think so that almost none of these liberals have a big chance. I still see Parolin, but really as the third rank contender. So, like I said, currently two-way struggle between the conservatives, which is probably Erdo, but I can't say that for certain, and the compromise candidate. And I think Erdo may be the front runner now, but I can't say that for sure. Whether it's Erdo or the compromise candidate who's winning, I don't feel 100% confident saying that. But I really think it's there where we need to look at the centrists.
Yeah, and let's do that. I think... Again, this is if I had to be, if I just to make a judgment call at the moment, I would say it's probably going to end up being with a compromise candidate. I just think that's, if there was a hardcore conservative put in there, it would be, I would be somewhat surprised. I'll say that much. But at the same time, if the liberals are in such shambles, I think anything can happen. But one person that I keep getting brought up, and he gets brought up constantly on YouTube media, and also just here in Rome, people are talking about him constantly. Even when I was at this place with all these Vatican journalists around Erdo, everybody was mentioning Cardinal Erdo and Cardinal Pizzaballa. Now, do you think Cardinal Pizzaballa's chances have changed much since the last time we've spoken? Have they improved? Is he looking like he could be a compromise candidate? Or is the conservative sort of rallying around Cardinal Pizzaballa, at least in popular media, does that make him less likely of an option? Who do you see being those compromise candidates?
I don't think Pizzaballa has really stopped being a possible compromise candidate. I don't think what some online Twitter people, specifically in the Anglo-Saxon sphere, say that's looked too closely. His chances may have increased slightly, but I have to say overall, I don't think they're extremely big because of still his age. It's the same I have with Ambongo from Africa. So I really do think anyone basically under at least 65, but probably 68, 69, chances are very small. And in a quick response to what you said there, indeed, chances of a hardcore conservative are limited, but I can't fully discount Serre if they manage to push the transitional pope angle. And I would say Erdo, in some ways, I think both him and Eijk are viewed by not a few people as, in a way, being moderate conservatives. So there then the issue really becomes, does it become a moderate conservative or a moderate? And so I would say that's somewhat of a toss-up, right? Like you said, you would suspect like a moderate, but I don't think you're discounting a moderate conservative, right? I mean, I view that as a toss-up. I'm curious how you view that.
No, I think you're right. Again, I would categorize someone like Erdo as being a moderate conservative. But
Okay.
I mean, I see there's so many people that would consider Erdo an arch conservative just because they're viewing things from a progressive angle. But yes, I think if we're speaking in that dynamic, I would agree with you. I think it's probably a moderate. I think a moderate conservative could definitely in those categories could definitely take the pontificate.
Okay, so you also think it's a toss-up between basically Erdo or whoever's framed as the real moderate. That's also it's also kind of a toss-up to you.
Yeah, that's what it seems to me. I think those moderates could actually be more conservative than what we're expecting. Like somebody like Cardinal Pizzaballa, I think is categorized as moderate. He could turn out to be a real conservative. I just think I think somebody who is, of course, Mueller, Burke. I think they're sort of just out of the picture at the moment. It's really up to those moderate conservatives or those moderates. But do you see any moderates that are leaning? Let's dive into that.
Yeah, so the moderates. I think you probably have already guessed who's currently being touted as the moderate compromise candidate.
Mm-hmm.
So I assume you're also thinking of Robert Francis Prevost, the dicastery, the prefect for the dicastery of the bishops. Okay, so we were thinking of the same man. Initially, there were some who were speculating that it would become Gugurotti of the dicastery for Oriental churches, but so far he doesn't seem to get off the ground. And again, you can never discount that he's the dark horse compromise candidate hiding behind Robert Francis Prevost. So you always have to be prepared for the possibility. But currently, just as it seems as though Erdo is the conservative candidate, it seems as though Prevost is the compromise candidate. And I will say I prefer him to Gugurotti in part because of significant rumors that Gugurotti would be close to Parolin and that both would be Silvestrini proteges. And I have to say, having looked into that, it's partially guilt by association. And the things beyond that, he was undersecretary for a few years in the dicastery of Oriental churches, still called the Congregation then, when Silvestrini was its prefect, and they did work well together. But the idea that he really was his protege seems to have been first pushed in that book, Gone with the Wind in the Vatican, and that became very popular amongst traditionalists a lot later due to everything happening under Francis. But it should be noted that while that book seems to also have some accurate stories, there are just some factual inaccuracies in there. That's one. And two, while it pushes some popular talking points from traditionalists, while it seems to flirt with things of Our Lady of Fatima and criticisms of the new Mass, it also pushed that the church should become democratized. It was critical of conservative sexual ethics, and it glorified John the 23rd as what was preferable to Pope Paul VI and John Paul II, not Pope Pius XII. So I think it even pushed women priests. So that book definitely needs to be taken with a grain of salt. And after that, you do see other outlets, and even I think like a CIA thing, reference Gugurotti as a protege of Silvestrini when it was describing as well as nuncio in Eastern Europe and all that. But the question is then, is that contamination from possible gossip? So I can't say for certain he is a Silvestrini protege, but the chance is big enough that I don't want to take my chances on that, and I don't want him to become the next pope. Thankfully, it doesn't seem like they're pushing him as the compromise candidate. Kikuchi from Japan doesn't really seem to be pushed as such either. I sometimes suspected Stephen Brislin from South Africa would be pushed, but so far I don't see him coming off the ground. Weirdly enough, I would have suspected Yu Heung-sik, the prefect for the dicastery of clergy from South Korea. I would have expected to have heard a lot more about him. I've heard pretty much nothing. So either he's the best hidden dark horse ever, or for some reason moderates or progressives thought he was too conservative, or I don't know what was going on there. Why didn't it go for him? Because it's to me just weird. But yeah, it seems that it's settled on Robert Francis Prevost. Cardinal Turkson, I should mention, would have been another compromise candidate, and he is mentioned on occasion. And I think Turkson has more chances than Pizzaballa and Ambongo because he's more of a real centrist. He's not as right-leaning, and he's older. He's over 75, so I think that speaks in his favor. And he does have experience in Rome, so he's more chances than someone like Kikuchi. So yeah, I'd say out of all of the moderates who would have a significant chance, at this point, I think there's really only 5, so it's Brislin, and I would rank him last, then Gugurotti, and as the top 3 moderates who I could see surprisingly appearing, Yu Heung-sik, Turkson, and finally Prevost in that order. So I think Prevost or Turkson, but probably just really Prevost is what we might end up with. So then I guess many people would have to question, what kind of centrist would Prevost be like? That's now, he's probably one of the most unknown cardinals to most people, and he might become the next pope. It might be him versus Erdo, and then the question of who will win. So
Yeah, I mean and the things you were mentioning there at the beginning, that warrants a whole nother show, especially again talking about that book Gone with the Wind in the Vatican and the influence of Silvestrini. That's stuff that has gotten brought up recently just because of these cardinals. People are sort of just looking back, what were people saying? I'm sure longtime traditionalists will know that very well. That whole book's about it's quite complicated. It's just one of those books that very controversial. Again, as you mentioned, talking about scandal, corruption within the Vatican. I think there's even mentions of like Satanism in the Vatican as well. Very controversial book there. But again, it gets back to that influence of Silvestrini. So I think that's going to warrant another show. But I think you're ultimately right that I think Provost does end up looking like he's one of the stronger moderate cardinals. That at least that's how this is shaken up at the moment. I get a similar sense here on the ground in Rome. I still think it's Pizzaballa is in the mix. I don't think the Roman journalists would be this obsessed with him if that wasn't the case. And I also just think it almost makes sense from just a geopolitical standpoint how some people could rally around him. But yeah, it's very interesting. I think people are going to have to do some major reading up on things, looking back to those influences. And again, Gone with the Wind in the Vatican. It's not a book I can endorse by any means, but it shows some of these influences. There's going to be a ton of required reading on these potential cardinals if they're elected. But to sort of wrap things up, Serre, as we enter into this. I mean, by this time next week, we could realistically have a new pontiff. Let's talk about, just to wrap things up, who is in the lead. If we can make maybe three definitive choices: conservative, moderate, liberal. I don't suggest people go bet on the Pope, but who do you think, if we just are willing to generalize, who do you think's in the lead in all three of those categories, and who do you think out of all those three is in the lead completely? Who would you bet, quote unquote, is going to be the next Pope?
So, as of this day, because things can always, as of this day of what we know, if there's no darker stuff being pushed, to all appearances, Parolin still is then the liberal one just by default, just because of how horrible everything else is.
Yeah.
Provost for the centrists, Erdo for the conservatives. And Parolin is then a clear third. So it would become a race between Erdo and Provost. And I would say, like I said previously, I feel less confident making predictions about it, but currently it does seem to me as though Erdo has a slight edge. So he's a front runner, but he can be the front runner who trips. But the reason I think he currently has the slight edge is because Provost does have more accusations of just not handling abuse well enough. And in his case, it's quite a bit of circumstantial things, but they just add up. It's a lot of circumstantial things, both in Peru and as an Augustinian. So there's that. There's the fact that he's centrist in a way that might be too centrist, as in he's too unknown to many. Yuang Sik, for example, would just have a few more views that's well known. It would be like, okay, so he's clearly not going to support women priests, but he does support reforms of seminaries, and he's not the biggest fan of clericalism without really abolishing the priesthood in a Protestant way. So that's acceptable to both sides. Where with Provost, it's, you don't really know, and Provost has worked with Chupich and Tobin as his colleagues in the Dicastery of Bishops when he was an ordinary member. And the question is how close he is to them. He's originally from Chicago, and he has been friendly with Chupich, also with his predecessor, Francis George, I should say, for the sake of fairness. So such associations, basically not being extremely well known, and with what is known of you, to some people, the first thing they might learn about you is like, he seems to be friendly with Chupich, and really whether that's just being good colleagues or not, that would be the question. I currently see that being a handicap. With Erdo, people know what they're getting. He was Relator General for the Family Synod, and he worked constructively with Francis rather than being in the opposition like Berg or later Mueller and then Pell. He's never taken the anti-Francis route. He had a very respectful stance during the Synod, and due to that, he's well known across the world, and he's known as this moderate consensus-seeking conservative who doesn't really rock the boat either way. that helps him. The fact that he's a real canon lawyer expert of the highest level in a time that canon law has been circumvented and gutted by Francis, and there's a lot of uncertainty about what both the Synod and the new Curie constitution mean for canon law. That helps. And finally, he was head of the European Bishops' Conference, the overarching organization, for 10 years. More than 5 of which were when Orban was already prime minister in Hungary. So he was capable of just being a unitive figure for Europeans while Orban had come to power in Hungary. So he did not quickly become tainted by that. And he's been friendly with Orban, but he seems to be more friendly with the Hungarian ambassador, who's Edward Habsburg, who's a very respectable figure who can be liked internationally. And as head of the European bishops, he also met a lot with African bishops, and he managed to be liked by them too. So he's interacted with African, European, and obviously also Asian in the context of that synod, bishops and cardinals. And he's always basically been a man of proper discussion and of mixing orthodoxy with consensus. So I do think that gives him the advantage. The real question is, can it be acceptable to the 2/3? Does he not eventually hit a roadblock at, say, 55 or 60%? And does that then not lead to some kind of pragmatic deal with whoever then seems the more moderate? Because some people were implying that Parolin could be moderate compared to Prevost. And I don't get that, but maybe there's a weird inside thing nobody knows about and not even I know about. But so, yeah, Erdo is the front runner, but not in a certain position. So I think, to me, Erdo feels like Ratzinger in 2005, likely but not guaranteed.
Yeah, and I think in a similar way to Ratzinger, we could see that roadblock be resolved with making personal deals with various cardinals. It was, it's alleged that Ratzinger gave out various personal favors that broke the roadblock, and that's how we got a Pope Benedict XVI. So we could see that with Erdo. But again, I think it's up in the air with some clear favorites in mind. I will add as well, Prevost is looking at him. I think one thing that might be going against him is being an American as well. I think because again, he's not a diocesan bishop; he's a curial bishop, but it's still going to play a role in this current political climate. Are the cardinals really going to center around this guy from Chicago, this bishop from Chicago? I struggle to see it, but we just have to. It does seem that the I don't want to say the stars are aligning, but it does seem that it has been suggested that Prevost might be that compromise candidate. They have a few options that I'm sure they're going to be going through. This is why I think that if we don't get a rapid decision, and maybe we can end on this, Serre, if we don't get a rapid decision, in my view, within, let's say, under 30 hours, I think this could be at least in modern times, a historically long conclave, simply to deal with all these things. Do you agree? How long do you see this conclave going for?
I see it somehow likely going for 3 to 4 days, if I would have to guess. I see some kind of deal being reached then, and that is an interesting point you made. I will quickly say on Prevost, some might view more as a Latin American candidate because he was a missionary diocesan bishop for a couple of years in Peru, but whether currently being viewed as half Latin American after Francis is going to help you, I have my doubts there. So that's very questionable. And when it comes to compromises, I think because there were these rumors that Parolin would be trying to reach a deal with the Conservatives, but I don't think Parolin would be trusted to keep his words. Prevost might, so that might be able to help Prevost. But yeah, I will say also about that. I will finally say about that I think Erdo could make successful deals to remove those roadblocks, in as much as if he promises Parolin that he can stay till at least 75, that he can just ride out his term as the Secretary of State. And heck, he can extend it to Prevost. He can be like, you can have your 2 5-year terms. You can be here till you're past 75. You can do it with Ewing, Sick, and with Gugurotti. He can do it with mostly everyone except for Fernandez and Roche, because these prefects are competent enough. They're not Francis's worst appointments. They're not too radical. So I can see Erdo just winning over most of the Curie by telling them, I won't rock the boat. So that can help Erdo, but it can also help Prevost. And that's why we don't have that two-way struggle.
Yeah, definitely. So your conclusion is about 3 to 4 days then, I think, and that would be somewhat historically long. I think if we look at the past, people will, especially once we hit the 48-hour mark, things are going to start heating up very quickly. So very interesting, Serre. Do you have any final words before we get going?
Yes, I would advise everybody to continue praying and to specifically pray the novena suggested by Cardinal Burke. Bishop Snyder, Father Rippinger, and other similar devotions. I would advise them for that. If there's any bad news that not enough people are familiar with, like corruption or bad deeds by cardinals, say something from Parolin we didn't even know about yet, or Tagle or Provost, scream it from the rooftops. That would be my advice.
Look, either way, it's something people need to continue to pray about. What are we here on earth to do? It's to grow in virtue, to avoid vice, and to grow in the grace of God. And the way I think all this conclave news, it can actually be helpful for us, because we can actually see if we're categorizing cardinals by in these different categories of conservative, liberal, and we have to ask ourselves why. I think it almost forces us to have to study the faith. And that's a very interesting thing. So we actually have an opportunity here to grow in our knowledge of our faith, to grow in devotion as well, praying for the church, praying for the cardinals, getting in a better routine. So as long as we're not getting caught up in a sort of mudslide of just muck around us, thinking about the scandals constantly, and going to despair, if we're actually treating this in a prayerful and scholarly way of actually studying our faith, this can actually be very beneficial for us. And so, Serre, I think you've provided a lot of resources for people to really have a good insight into this conclave. This is going to be a historic conclave just because we've had so many resources. So thanks again. And for all of our audience, may God grant you many joyful years.